What my intention for the session is that the session is practical, that I'm going to give you some things that you can play with and use in real time as we unfold them. And the idea of the patterns or the techniques I'm going to show you and work with you around is how to generate not just restorative movement, but the state of being that we need to be in order for restorative movement to work really well. So what would be great if you guys are okay with this is if we could make this, to the best extent we can, interactive. So I've not used the Zoom platform before, and what I'd really like to do, if possible, is to have the chat box working. So what I'd love to have happen is if you can just tap just any single letter in the chat box so I can see how that works. And then if I ask you a question and the answer might be a yes or no question, you can simply type in a Y or a no, or I might ask you something where we might want to scale something on a 1 to 10 and you can type in a 1 to 10. Or if you want to ask a question or make a comment, then please do. So what I've got in mind is to show you some processes that I use in my practice on a day-to-day basis. Now, the practices you're going to learn are not new to you. This is an embodiment conference, so I'm highly convinced that there's nothing you're going to hear that you haven't heard before. I'm going to be talking about things like breathing and movement. I guess you've heard a lot about that already. And you'll also be hearing about rest and digest and parasympathetic nervous system, etc. But what I'm hoping is that the angle I'll bring might be a little bit different and might give you a slightly different slant on things. So one way that has helped me in the past as an avid learner to get a new take on things is to approach the session with a kind of a mindset of imagining that I've never heard any of this before. So I'm temporarily disbanding my knowledge and my filters and just hearing it as if I'm hearing it for the first time. And at the end of the session, when we're finished, by all means, bring back what you know and then check what we've explored against what you know and chuck out what's not useful and keep and play with what might be useful. So if that sounds like a good idea to you, just type in a Y in the chat box so I know that I've got your attention, and then we can get into it and get started. Yay, awesome. And also please feel free at any time. If you want to interrupt me or ask me a question, I'm quite comfortable with that. So I might not have the answer straight away for you, but I'm really open to you just asking me questions. It's all good as gold. So I've got no idea of how the time of this is going to run. I might find that we run through real quick and then we've got a time at the end to do an open frame. Or we might find that as we go along, the session just kind of disappears and before we know it, an hour's gone. So let's get into it. Restorative movement is basically, as you know, movement that's designed to enable someone to heal, to repair, to recover. And my view is that when you're in that state of restorative movement, any movement can be restorative. And so I've simplified what I do down to really work with people who are not embodied experts. They're not, generally speaking, professional dancers or martial artists or yoga teachers, Pilates teachers, Feldenkrais experts. They typically are ordinary people with just a general day-to-day experience of life. And I'm using these techniques to get those people to enter into a restorative movement state, into a rest and digest state. And I do it by using simple movements and simple language and metaphors. And so I'm hoping that even though for many of you, what I'm going to show you is going to be basic and simple, you may be able to find something in what I'm saying that could be useful. So in my kind of work, I have a number of roles. I have a role as a body worker and as an osteopath. And I've also done various other forms of therapy, such as acupuncture, which get integrated in with points and whatnot. But predominantly these days, in terms of bodywork, I just use structural osteopathy as my framework. And I support that with some of the coaching work that I do. My other life is as a coach. And what you're going to kind of hear me talk about today is a little bit of an intersection between bodywork and coaching, because I'll be using language to activate and instigate certain processes in the body. Excuse me. So I just want to get a couple of basic, simple things that we probably all already understand and agree out on the table, just to make sure that we're all in agreement. So the first thing is that movement is essential to repair and recovery. We all know that that's true. And we know that life is movement and movement is everything. Everything in the universe is moving all of the time. And that's a premise that I work from in the work that I do. And although everything's moving all the time, how we move and how we think about how we move and the energy and the kind of soul that we bring to that movement can have a profound effect on whether that movement's restorative or just repetitive. So what I'd like to start with is a real simple beginning. Many of the patients that I work with come in acute pain, and you might recognize people in acute pain because they do this. They go, they flinch. When they move and pain hits them, they do this flinching movement where their body is tensing, and they have this expression on their face, which I just simply call the pain face. And so one of the first things that I'll work with, and I'll get us to play with this, is when we can start to control the pain face, we start to shift the whole system in the body. Because if you think about what it feels like, and I'll invite you to have a little play with this, think about a movement that you might do. And I want you to just maybe imagine that when you do this movement, it hurts. Let's not do this with anything too painful, but I want you to imagine, say, for example, you turn your head to the side and you get a spasm. So as you turn, you go, ooh, and you flinch. I want you to just do that for a moment and just feel what happens in your body when you do the pain face and the flinch. Just do that. Any movement you like. It could be a head turn like that. And notice what happens when you do that pain face. What happens to your shoulders? Which way do they go when you pain face? Yeah, I'm seeing shoulders go up. Okay. What happens when you do pain face to your breath? Do you take a gentle sigh or do you gasp? Typically, people take a breath, a gasping breath. Just check also what happens to your jaw when you do a pain face like that. And even just touch yourself. And as you do the flinch, notice what happens like that. Maybe you'll even feel a little vibration. Notice what happens to your diaphragm. Notice what happens to your eyes and the back of your neck. And all of these responses, these flinching responses, agitate and aggravate the body. And they don't support the person to go into a state of rest and digest and calmness. And in fact, if a person is spending enough time doing a pain face, it can create a whole loop of tension by itself. So what's the alternative? Well, for me, I use the word bliss because I love that word. And I'll get my clients to develop and cultivate a bliss face. So a bliss face where they feel calm and they feel relaxed and they feel comfortable. Even though they may still have some discomfort in their body when they move, it's choosing a new facial response rather than the pain face. And that changing of the facial response has an effect on influencing the whole of the rest of the body. So I'd just like to invite you to think about what a bliss face, or any other word you might want to use. It doesn't have to be bliss. It can be calm. It can be zen. It can be healing. It can be gentle. It can be whatever word evokes for you that feeling of rest, digest, calmness, and restoration. And so as you imagine that face and generate that face for yourself, let's do the same movement and imagine that you have the same pain that you had before. But this time as you turn or do your movement, instead of responding with the pain face, you just respond with the bliss face. And notice what happens to your shoulders. And notice what happens to your breath. And as you keep that bliss face working, notice what happens to your jaw and your diaphragm and your breathing. And you'll notice that as you go into that bliss phase, even though the pain may be there, the feeling in your body is different. And for people who are not used to embodied work, this is a really easy hack to get them to start to relax. It's a really simple way. In martial arts, we talk about controlling the head as a way of getting a person under control quite quickly. And although this is not martial arts, this is restoration. If we can control the face and the expressions there, it helps the body follow. So I call this the bliss face rather than the pain face. And this is something that anybody can do with someone who's got a pain. And the worst case scenario is it will make no difference, but it certainly won't make them worse. So how did that seem? Could you feel the difference? If you could feel the difference between the pain face and the bliss face, just type in a little yes. And if you get any questions coming up about that you'd like to ask, maybe just jot them down. And if we get time, we'll go to them at the end. So, okay, so we've got the bliss face idea. But how do we give that bliss face a flavor? How do we get the person to really feel resourced enough to be able to use that bliss face rather than just copying the movement because we tell them to? So I have another technique that I use for that. And this technique was kind of developed by accident as a result of working with a patient who told me they had a phobia of deep breathing. And I've never met a person with a phobia of deep breathing before. I've been in the business 30 years. And this person was flinching like crazy and they weren't able to relax. And so I asked them just to take a deep breath. And they said that they couldn't do it because of their phobia of breathing. And this went back about 4 years prior to when somebody had encouraged this person to take deep breaths and take a deep breath and take another deep breath. And they pretty much hyperventilated and passed out. And as a result of that, they were terrified of deep breathing. So I had a little moment with this person, a little insight popped into my head. And so I tried an idea out with this person. I said to this person, okay, let's forget about deep breathing, but let me ask you a question. Do you like the smell of flowers? And this person said, yeah, I love the smell of flowers. I said, okay, so if I had in my hand your favorite flower, what would it be? And I think she said it was a jasmine or a rose. I can't remember. So she said jasmine. So I said, okay, I just want you to imagine that I'm holding in my hand your favorite flower, and it's a gorgeous version of a jasmine. And I want to give it to you, and I want you to imagine you're holding it in your hand. And she said, it feels silly. I said, no, it's just a game, but let's try. Now put it up to your nose and have a smell of that fragrance. Take a lovely lingering sniff. And so she went, took that breath. I said, now savor that feeling, that flavor, that smell in your body. And when you're ready, just let it go. And so she did this and she was perfectly comfortable. I said, now just do that again. Just take that lovely sniff of that flower, savor it in your body, and then just breathe it out as if you're sighing a sigh of relief. And she went, I said, fantastic. So don't do deep breathing, do flower breathing. And that was the birth of this technique called the flower breath. So I now use that with people as a way to get them to access a form of deep breathing. And I've developed it a little bit. So what I'll get them to do, and you can imagine how you might use this. It doesn't have to be a flower. You can use a pot plant. You can use anything you like. But to imagine that they're holding in their hand a flower. They can feel it with their fingers. They can see it in the colors. They bring it to their nose and they can feel the petals on their nose. And they've got the opportunity in just a moment to sniff in and smell that fragrance. And there's a little bit of a game to give them a bit of anticipation around it. And then what I'll do with this technique is to say, and it's not just the fragrance of the flower. This is kind of like psychic aromatherapy. This is a chance for you to sniff in and smell that fragrance that's going to give you exactly what you need right now. And it might be calmness. It might be blissfulness. It might be some ease. It might be forgiveness. It might be confidence. But whatever it is you need right now, imagining this psychic aromatherapy as you take that gorgeous sniff from that flower, that you're going to get the resource you need to be able to do your exercises comfortably and confidently. And so that's a technique, I call it flower breathing. And I just wonder how that may well be something that you guys, you do a version of that. You do a version of that kind of breathing to give a person a resource. But by adding the modalities of the color of the flower, the texture of it, the sense of it against their nose, it's really getting their attention to start to wake up. So that's an interesting and useful technique. What do you guys think about that? Does that sound like something that could be useful? Just give us a little tap in the box. Can you imagine? Yeah, awesome. So when we get a person doing the bliss face, what I do with that, with those people who want to do bliss face, is get them to also do some flower breathing to give them that sense of resourcefulness and calmness that they need. So there's two techniques there that will be useful for anybody who doesn't have a background or a vocabulary around advanced embodied movement, because those metaphors are metaphors that everyone can understand. And the next technique that I'll work with people is, and funny enough, I saw some patients today, and one of the patients, she came back for a second visit. This is an elderly lady, 75, who suffers with severe degenerative change in her neck. A lovely old lady, sweet, sweet woman, but she can't turn her head. When she does, she's flinching with the pain, and she's in a terrible amount of pain. And she'd had lots of treatment with a physiotherapy clinic that was predominantly prescribing exercises. And the exercises were trying to stretch her neck into rotation and flexion. Every time she did the exercise, she was flinching and she was getting more and more distressed. And after 6 weeks of this, she decided that she couldn't do this anymore. So she was recommended to come and see me. And the first thing we looked at was how she was actually exercising. So another technique that I use, I call it the safe zone technique. So if you imagine that you're in a room and the room's got electrified walls, and if you touch the wall, you're going to get a shock. So if you touch the wall, you're going to get a shock. It's going to be painful. And you don't want to touch the walls, but you want to be able to cover as much space as possible. So you want to be able to go up to the wall and not touch the wall and get a shock. Or if you touch the wall very lightly, you don't get a shock. If you touch it too hard, you get a shock. Like an electric fence. And I kind of use that metaphor as a framework for finding a safe zone for people to be able to move in a range of movement that's not painful. Now that range of movement may be tiny, but if they can find a range of movement that's tiny, that's not painful, and they're not getting the flinching and they're not getting the tensing, then the tissues can start to relax and they start to relax. And that's what I spent the session with this elderly lady doing, getting her to do the movements within the range that she had. And to start with, she literally only had this much range, but wasn't painful. And it took a little while for her because she'd practiced going to the stretch point and the flinch point. And so that had become an automated pattern for her. She'd kind of myelinated that response. And so it was a challenge for her to do the movement small. Well, we got her to do the movement and said, that's all you need to do over the next week is just practice finding the range that's not painful. Because for her, she had inflammatory condition in her neck and it was irritating her and it was just making her worse and making her stressed. So she came back today and I asked her how she was doing. And she said, well, I can move my neck much, much further. It's still painful, but now I can do this, but it still hurts. So to me, that was a wonderful success because for one session, she'd been able to increase her range by probably 300%. And so the session we worked on today was more about reducing the pain in the process of the movement. And if we can start to generate gentle movements in a range that's not painful, the body can start to relax into it. And gradually that range will start to extend out and get wider and wider. And that's exactly what happened with this lovely old lady. And it's what I tend to do with people who've got acute pain due to an acute injury or people that are terrified of pain. Rather than stretching to the pain and flinch point, we can work within the range that's safe, and that range can gradually start to open out. So I call that safe zone working. Any questions?
Katie has a question in the chat box.
Yeah. Would you have used imagination before moving? The answer is sometimes yes. The order that I'm kind of, there's no set order to what I'm sharing here. I'll play it according to who's in front of me. I'll play it according to how the conversation pans out. Sometimes I'll only use one of these techniques, or sometimes I'll use none of them. I'm trying to create a structure here that seems to make sort of logical sense. But sometimes I'll spend maybe 10, 15 minutes even having a conversation that's framing movement as being really, really important for health and recovery. I'm not going to do that with you guys because you already know how important movement is. But what I might do with somebody who's not used to that is talk about how their system is designed for movement. And when they're moving in a way that's not stressful for their body, that's healthy for the body, it's restorative for the body, it's nourishing for the body. And I'll give them various different metaphors and stories around that. So in answer to your question, Heidi, yes, imagination would come up, absolutely. And really the exercise with the flower breathing, that's an exercise in imagination because obviously there is no flower there. The exercise with the bliss face is to some degree an exercise of imagining that you're in a state of bliss, and the experience of pain is no longer one that's causing you to flinch, tense, and become stressed, but one that's causing you to just be in acceptance of that pain. I might also tell stories about pain. So for example, pain itself is not a problem. Pain is just information. The problem is how that person is experiencing that information and what the information is pointing to. So if you've just broken your leg or you've had a terrible accident, pain is really useful to let you know you're in trouble so that you can get help. And in those situations, it's a little bit different to what I see in my clinic. I don't see that first responder trauma where we've got broken bones and severe injury. I'll see chronic pain or simple sprains and strains. But one of the frames that I'll use with people around pain is that pain's not the problem. The problem's the suffering that we experience when we don't like our pain or we don't have a relationship with the pain. And I'll ask them to imagine that pain, instead of being this uncomfortable experience that they don't like, is simply information designed to keep them alive. And in the modern system that we live in, we hear words like pain relief, painkillers. You've got to go and get some painkillers. And if we was to transpose the word pain for information and say, hey, I've got some problem, I need to get some information killer because my body's giving me some information, so I need to kill that information, or I need to get some relief from that information, then that kind of doesn't quite work. And it helps people understand, at least to some small degree, that the pain could be having an important piece of information for them around how they need to move or what they need to do. And I'll also talk about how in our development as a species, movement has been the thing that's allowed us to evolve and to develop to where we are. The fact that we can move has allowed us to explore different environments, to build things. And so movement is an essential component of human life. And what we want to do when we move is be able to cope with the information our body gives us around how we need to move. So I'll talk about it in ways like that. It just really depends on who's in front of me. Does that make sense? Does that help? This is probably not new stuff for you guys. So, would you have used imagination for to help with moving without pain? Yeah, I'll come to moving without pain, Heidi, because moving without pain is gorgeous, glorious, beautiful, and wonderful. And it's a big part of what I'll get people to do as part of their ongoing self-care practice. But this first step is how we deal with pain when they're coming in and they're in that flinchy stage. So removing the pain phase and getting the body calm is a first step. Let's assume that we've got someone to the stage where they're relaxing their face, they've got their bliss face going, and they've resourced themselves with calmness and ease, and maybe even a kind of a natural analgesic to soften unnecessary pain in their system. So it gives them permission to start to move and activate the system into restoration. And they're moving within their nice safe zone, so they're not straining themselves. The next thing I'll look at with them is, well, how do you move? Do you move mechanically? What's the quality of the movement that you need to use in order to evoke and generate a healing quality in your body? And so I'll get them to imagine a couple of things, and I'll get you guys to imagine it too, if that's okay. So I want you to just play along with what I'm going to ask you to do using your imagination. I want you to imagine you've got a baby in your arms. You're holding a baby in your arms. So hold the baby in your arms. And I want you to imagine that that baby is fretting. Maybe the baby's being poorly. Maybe the baby needs to sleep. The baby's in some form of discomfort. And if you were holding that baby, there's a good chance you would naturally start to move with that baby. You'd start to sway. You'd do that intuitively. That rhythm that you would use to sway that baby is innate. Kind of everyone knows how to do that. And I call that rhythm, in my little world, a healing rhythm, because the intention of that rhythm is to soothe and ease and relax. But it's not just babies, you know, if you've got, imagine a puppy or a kitten. If you're a puppy person, have a puppy. If you're a kitten person, have a kitten. Or if you want, you can even have a hamster. But a creature, a small creature, a little pup or a kitten that's terrified. Maybe the fireworks are going off and the little creature's shaking. Its system's activated and it's nervous. You'd probably pet that creature. You'd probably stroke it. And there's a way in which you'd stroke it. You wouldn't kind of dig away at it. You'd be soft. You'd be gentle. That rhythm's not dissimilar to the way you might sway with a baby that you're wanting to soothe. They also call that a healing rhythm. And one final example of this might be if you've got a relative or a person in your life that you care about, and that person is poorly and they need to sleep. And imagine they're in a rocking chair and you get to rock them in the rocking chair. You get to rock them off to sleep. That kind of pace that you'd use in your movement, again, not dissimilar to swaying the baby or stroking the dog that's scared. That quality of movement, I would call it a healing rhythm. And I would have my patients or the people I'm working with, my clients, if it's coaching, feel that rhythm in their body. And not just the speed and pace of the rhythm, but also the intention that goes with that. The sense of kindness and support that they beam towards the person that they're soothing. The love and the affection that goes to that baby or that dog. And I'll then ask them to take that same feeling and self-apply it. So that as they move, whether it's a simple movement or whether it's just simply even just touching themselves, that they do that in the same way and with the same kind of self-love as they would give to others. Because for many people, and I don't know what it's like if you're working in embodied practice, but for many people, it's a struggle for them to apply to themselves the same level of love, gentleness, and kindness that they might be willing to do with other people. So that kind of healing rhythm idea is something that most people can get because it's an innate rhythm that you'll understand if you've ever held a baby, stroked a dog, or even rocked yourself. So we start to build up this little repertoire of patterns and movements, and the simple label on those patterns that I use with people, I can use again with people, and I'll remember it quite easily. It reactivates. I'll say, do you remember we talked about that healing rhythm, like the way you stroke the head of the baby, or the way that you stroke the dog, or the way that you might just rub the cheek of somebody that you love who's poorly. That quality of movement, I want you to put that quality into the way you're moving when you're working on yourself. And when they can get that quality, then almost any movement can become a healing movement. Almost any movement can be restorative, because it's the quality of the movement that's generating the shift into the rest and digest state. It's the quality of the movement that's soothing and calming them. And rather than getting caught up in getting the technique right, for which there's a place, for the clients that I see who are typically not maybe coordinated enough to understand a complex movement, I'll get them to focus simply on the quality of the movement. And then from that quality of the movement, we can start to build in some specific muscle work. But if we get the quality right first, then it's easier, in my experience, than trying to go for structural correctness. That making sense? Cool. Any questions so far? Because I know I'm kind of offloading at you guys, and it's kind of interesting just watching your faces there. Any questions at this stage? And feel free to talk as well. I know it's easier to type, and I'm really appreciating that you're typing. But if you have a question that you want to ask, feel free to do that.
If you want to directly ask a question, you can go down to participants and open that up, and you can see an icon to raise your hand, and we will unmute you.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm here, lovely, a lovely comment here. That's what I'm working with as an Alexander teacher, the quality of movement. And for me, what I'd like to just kind of get across is there are many ways up the mountain of movement to get people in an embodied state that's giving them the outcomes that they want. And all of the ways up work. And in my experience, I trained as a dancer. I trained as a Graham dancer, which was incredible, and I really enjoyed that. And I did various different types of martial arts. And then I went from Graham dance, which is contemporary dance, into theatrical dancing, which is like modern jazz and tap. And that was quite different. But ultimately, although there's a different philosophy and a different a style to movement, movement is still movement. And if we can get people into an embodied state, whether it's through yoga, whether it's through Alexander, whether it's through Pilates, meditation, mindfulness, or whatever, as long as they get into that state, that for me is the most important thing. So let me give you another thing that I do now. And again, imagine this is building up as a kind of a stacking process. And typically this would be, a guy who's a builder, who's the nearest thing to exercise he does is lift bags of cement and uses a hammer at work. Maybe once a week or twice a week he goes to the gym and does some weights and does a bit of grunting and has a good time. But he's not a yoga guy, and he's not a 5 rhythms dance guy, and he's not into meditation. But he needs to get into a restorative state. Or like my little old lady that came in today. She's the closest she gets to exercise is just going for a walk or going to do the shopping. And let's assume that we've built up this little repertoire of exercises, including the working with the pain face, which becomes the bliss face. Being able to use the imagination to resource the body with the qualities it needs to be able to move, be those qualities calmness, gentleness, self-care, self-love, confidence, whatever it is that they need, and they can use the psychic aromatherapy approach. That in that initial stage, they're tracking where their safe zone of movement is. And if pain disappears and they no longer feel pain, then that safe zone of movement just becomes wherever they feel comfortable moving. So rather than pushing themselves to extremes just for the sake of pushing to extreme, starting to listen to their body around how far they want to be able to move. And then hopefully, if they've got to that stage and they're wanting to do some really deep self-care process, they can start to implement, when it's required, that healing rhythm to give themselves that kind of boost of self-care. So let's say that they've got to that stage and they're using all of those processes. The next stage that I might use with them is what I call finding the impulse to move. So that instead of them just thinking about the movements that they need to do, they can hand it over to their body, because the body's intelligence is phenomenal. And I might spend a little time framing that with them. I might say to them something along the lines of, you know how intelligent your body is? It's so intelligent that we can't even begin to comprehend what it can do. A tiny sperm and a tiny egg have the intelligence to get together and divide and build a whole human being. Not only that, when you build a human being, as that human being lives its life, the body's intelligence knows how to keep the heart beating 24/7, every minute of the day. It knows how to convert oxygen into energy, food into fuel. It knows how to keep you walking upright and seeing and hearing and having conversations. And there's 100,000 other processes that it's doing at the same time, because that's the intelligence of the system. And there's us with our conscious mind trying to work out what we think the best idea is. And in comparison to the intelligence of our system, we know nothing. So what I encourage them to do is to appreciate how much their system knows, and then to use that and entrust that to their system so they can start to feel impulses to move their body in a way that's coming from the body and not from their head. So in a simple way, with someone who's not used to this, I might get them to do that by getting them to become still and just to relax and just paying attention to their body, just tuning in. And I'll just use language that's simple for them. And I'll invite them to invite their body to provide them with an impulse to move. Now, that impulse to move will hopefully be something that's unexpected for them, because if they're having to think about it, then it's head-driven rather than body-driven. And I'll encourage them to just play with whatever comes up, just to accept the offer that they think they're getting from their body. That's an improv term, if anyone's done improv. So if they feel that that's the movement that they want to do, or that's the movement that they want to do, not to analyze that movement, not to get intellectual about that movement, but to just feel the impulse and go with it. And initially I'll get them to feel the impulse and go with it, and then just come back to that neutral centered position, and then feel another impulse, and become surprised and discover what movements your body might do. Just allow it to surprise you. And it happens, and it happens quite quickly. And then over a period of time, maybe 2 or 3 minutes of doing this, the invitation becomes, and now we can start to join some of those movements up. As you join some of those movements up, you'll start creating your own personal little dance, your own personal little expression of movement. And that expression of movement that you're doing has probably never been done exactly that way by anyone else before. Just like the whole series of words that I'm using in this presentation or this conversation. These words have been used before, but not in this order. And when we start to feel the impulses of our body and allow ourselves to be surprised by what comes from within rather than the head, then we'll start to experience movements that we may not have done before. And this starts to activate new neurology. Because a big part of the work that I do, whether it's the coaching or the body work, is to get people to generate new neurology so they can break patterns that are not working for them. I'm a firm believer in the idea that if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. And if you keep doing what's not working, you'll keep feeling what you're feeling. So it's really about experimenting and exploring and playing and trying out different things and getting different responses and see what happens. If what you do feels good and your body kind of seems to like that, then do a bit more. If it feels uncomfortable or it feels uncomfortable in a way that feels wrong, then you can park it or leave it, maybe come back to it later. But the most important thing is to generate some new neurology around movement, because otherwise all we're doing is repeating the old. Now, at the same time as saying that, there's value in repetition. There's value in the basics. When I did martial arts, I was very fortunate that I was trained by an extremely proficient Japanese sensei who was ordained as a Zen Buddhist monk in Japan. He was one of the senior teachers from the Honbu, the Busen, the school. And I kind of became one of his special students. And I reached a certain level. And he said to me, it's time to teach you how to do this stuff properly. So he invited me to his house, which was amazing. I went to his house and he said, okay, we're going to have a 2-hour session today. And we spent the first 2-hour session with me learning to just stand in a still position with my hands like this, down in front of me. And they called it the Kesh position. And I had to spend 2 hours doing that position. And I was thinking to myself, when am I actually going to learn the stuff that he's going to teach me? And then the following week, he taught me a simple movement. It was a movement that we'd done from white belt day one, but he got me to do that movement slowly and to really feel every micron of that movement happening in my body. So I slowed it down to the most incredible pace, and he got me to keep doing that. And I found it quite boring. I didn't understand what I was doing. But it turns out that what he was actually demonstrating to me was a concept. If anyone's read the book Talent Code is an amazing book, and it's about how we develop high-level competence by developing myelinated neurology. And this Talent Code book looks at people all across the world that become really good at what they do really quickly. And the common denominator between them is how they practice. And they practice using this concept that he's termed deep practice, which is that they slow down and they slow down and they do it in a way so slow that to a person watching on the outside, it doesn't look like the movement. It's in a musical sense, if the person's using deep practice, they're playing their piece so slowly, an observer can't understand what the music is. But by laying in that foundation, repeating over and over again, they can then take off and they go way past other people that started at the same time. So there's a real value in repetition, but there's also a value in slowing down. There's also a value in paying attention and not just repeating a movement over and over again in a mindless, disconnected way. So, making sense? How are we doing for time? So for me, it's not what specific movement you do, it's how you move, when you move, how you drive those movements in terms of your intention, in terms of your thinking, and how you experience those movements in every inch, micron, or millimeter of that movement, because all of the movement is important. And one of the ways that I'll kind of explain that, again using a metaphor, is the metaphor of the difference between mechanic and organic movements. By mechanical movements, I mean a man-made machine, a piston that moves up and down, you know, like you might see in a factory, or if you see a robot that's assembling something on an assembly line. There's a mechanical quality to that movement. It's repeats and there's very little variance in it. And that's quite a different quality to the kind of movement you'll see if you look at the ocean. Or if you look at a tree and you look at the leaves move as the breeze passes through the trees and it moves the leaves. Those leaves will move and they'll do their dance, and there's a good chance that that specific dance won't be exactly repeated ever again. But the quality of the movement will be there. So there's this kind of organic, natural quality to movement that we see in nature. And what I'm encouraging my clients to do is really connect with what it feels like to move organically rather than mechanically. And so as a result of that, I've abandoned a whole range of exercises that I used to use when I labeled myself sports injury therapist. Spent many years, because of my background in dance and martial arts, doing a whole heap of sports injury work and rehab work using kind of standard gymnasium type rehab. And I've moved away from that completely. Not because it's not valuable or useful, it's just not, it's not appealing to me and to the kind of nature of how I want to move in a fully embodied and organic kind of soulful way. So if I can get my clients and my patients to get that sense of organic movement rather than mechanic movement, and I get them to start experimenting with that, what I notice is a shift and a quality in their state of how they're moving. It's more engaging because the movement each time is going to be that little bit different. It's very easy to set up a pattern that just becomes a repetition that you can do without thinking. But when you're fully embodying each piece of the movement, then there's a different sense of connection to it. Does that make sense? Now, who's left? We're getting a few people disappearing, which is fine. I can understand that. Let me finalize with one more thing, and then this is one more thing that I use, because it's not always possible to move. You might be in a situation where you're feeling pain, but you can't necessarily move around. You might be in a meeting or somewhere like that, or you might be in a situation where it's just not appropriate. And what I'm going to share with you next doesn't just apply to being in pain. It can apply to feeling stressed. It can apply to feeling tense, to feeling wound up. And it would be wonderful if you could just move, but sometimes that's not possible. So this little process is something I'll give people to do when they don't actually want to physically move their body, but they want to create the energy of movement in their body. They want to create the soul of movement in their body. So can I just get a quick idea? Who's heard of micro muscle movements? Who knows what a micro muscle movement is? If you know what a micro muscle movement is, just type in a yes. If you don't know what it is, type an N for no. And I'll show you one way that I teach people who don't know what micro muscle movements are. Okay, so there's lots of no's there. So when we do a gross movement, our wonderful, our body moves and we can feel that movement occurring. And there's a neurology and a system that fires that movement off. And we can make a gross movement and we can have an effect in our body. But we can also have an equally profound effect if we make that movement smaller. And the interesting thing about making something smaller is technically if you halve something, you can keep halving it for infinity. Now that's a theoretical idea, as my son pointed out. He's a mathematician. In practice, when you halve things down and up, eventually there's nothing left and you're getting into the quantum level. And I don't want to get into a quantum conversation, but sufficient to say that the concept of halving a movement is that we can halve a movement down to the extent that externally we can't perceive a movement, but internally we're still firing and running the neurology that drives that movement. And in fact, there's been studies done that show that micro muscle movement or imagining movement can increase muscle strength by up to 33% in some cases. It can increase muscle bulk. It can increase flexibility. And it can improve cardiovascular fitness. So there's an incredible benefit to being able to have that in your toolbox if you're in a situation where larger movements are not available to you. So one of the simple ways that I get somebody who's not used to this kind of conversation to doing a movement is I'll get them to do a movement that they're comfortable with. It could be any movement. And we can try that now. We can do any movement. Just allow your body to have an impulse for any movement you want. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just a movement that feels good for you to do. And you do that movement and you just experience and feel the sense of that movement in your body and the whole joy of that movement. And what we're going to do is we're going to halve the movement to find how small we can make it as a micro muscle movement to activate that neurology. So let's do that movement again, but this time make it half the size. As you make the movement half the size, your intention, your attention, and what's going on in your internal experience remains just as committed. So do that movement again. And now make it even smaller. And as the movement becomes smaller, the awareness of the movement increases. So you're kind of going less on the gross physical level, but you're kind of becoming more internal with that movement. And then reduce it again, and then again. So you reach that point where externally it's imperceptible, but you can still feel that impulse to move. You can feel the neurology firing and the effect that that's having on your body. And as you relax your body, you might notice that little twitch, almost imperceptible. And that twitch is having an effect. It's firing neurologically and it's influencing your system. And it's a beautiful way of exercise. I'll give you an example. Last night in bed, I was laying awake at 3 o'clock, feeling a bit nervous about this session tonight. Now, I was lying there and I was applying all my techniques, self-applying, and I was still feeling agitated. I was breathing, I was doing everything. And I thought, okay, this is not working for me. So I decided to go for a run in my mind. It goes back to what you said, Heidi, about imagination. So I went into my body in a very still way. But in my mind, I began moving beautifully. I began running through a forest. And I was running like a gazelle, jumping over streams and rivers. Now, the interesting thing is I hate running. I can't stand jogging. It's not fun for me to do and I don't enjoy it. But in my mind, I was running, doing jogging, and I was doing it with micro muscle movements because I didn't want to flail about with too big of movements because my wife was in bed next to me and she might have thought I was having a mad moment. So I was taking this run through this amazing forest using these micro muscle movements. And I had a wonderful experience doing that. And that was the turning point for me last night that enabled me to go into a state of sleep. So I used it practically in that situation. And I'm just wondering if you could see how there might be some cases where those micro muscle movements could be practiced and developed for people. So particularly if they're unable to move, maybe they've had a paralysis, maybe they've had a spinal injury, maybe they've had something go on that's meant it's difficult for them to be able to have the full expression of movement. They can still function at the level of the neurology and the energy of movement. What do you guys think about that idea? Does that sound useful? Okay, so I'm seeing on, cool. I'm seeing on my time that it's 7:54. So I'm assuming that we're kind of coming to a close. And I'd just like to really quickly just remind you very briefly about what we covered. We covered looking at the face, the pain face and the bliss face, and how taking control of the face can really help start to lead the body. We talked about using the flower breath or the psychic aromatherapy to resource somebody to create that state they need to be able to move in a restorative way. We talked about the safe zone of movement for people who are panicking or in severe pain, to get them to start to create movement that works for them without agitating their system. We talked about the healing rhythm, stroking the cat, rocking the baby, and starting to apply not just the space and the pace of the healing rhythm, but also the intention and the self-care to one's own body that one would give to another body. We talked about finding the impulse to move and start to trust the body to present us with a surprise or a movement that it wants to do, rather than us controlling it in headspace land. There's a place for both. And then we talked about letting those impulses start to join up, so you create your own unique, beautiful expression of movement, or your own dance, your own unwinding attention. And then finally, we looked at the micro muscle movements as a way of being able to get the quality of movement going when you're in a situation where you can't necessarily move your body physically. The key to all of that is really about generating a state of rest and digest, a state of healing and calm. And when you're in that state, almost any movement can become restorative movement. So that's been my presentation.